Jim, first of all, I would like to thank you for joining us this morning and to thank you for your support of the State of Israel for many years.
My honor.
Before we start, maybe you would like to refer to the latest news. You have a new Secretary of State.
We do. Mike Pompeo, who was Director of Central Intelligence until very recently, he still is, I guess. An able individual, top of his class at West Point, distinguished himself both in the Army and as a congressman. Mike is candid and clear about what he thinks, but he doesn't try to buffalo people and get them to go along with him. He plays it straight. I think he'll be a good Secretary of State.
Okay. When you were the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, one of the maybe most important mission was the counter-proliferation, especially from the former Soviet Union this time, North Korea, China, to the entire world, especially to our area, Iran, Iraq then, Syria, etc. I think that our first meeting was while one of your visits in Israel. You visited our unit and we discussed this subject. Now, if you try to compare the current challenges, maybe of the new director of the CIA, and compare it to the current challenges, especially to the cyber threat.
Cyber is changing a lot because things can happen so fast. The Russians, for example, have had a program, I guess you could call it, disinformation, going back to the 30s, really, which is essentially to disrupt the value systems and the organizational structure of their adversaries, and to do it vigorously. Mike Pacepa, who was the head of a Romanian intelligence when he defected in '79, says that there are more people involved in disinformation in the Russian military, taken as a whole, than are in their armed forces. And whether that's an accurate characterization or not, Mike has no interest in doing anything but calling that straight. He still lives under cover in the West. And I think it's important to realize that what has changed for a lot of counterproliferation and related issues is not so much the substance. What's changed is the speed. And because cyber means that you have to act very quickly and respond very quickly. And it's changed a lot. The Russian meddling in our last election, the history of disinformation, all of that, as well as the actions of cyber groups on the outside, has really meant that you don't get to sit and rest. You have to move very quickly, and you have to play offense, not just defense. If you decided you wanted to play soccer today and you were going to have your team consist entirely of goalies, you would be somewhat in the same bucket as a number of people who think that that's all they really have to do in the world of cyber. Wrong. You got to play offense as well, and it has to be smart and clever and crafty offense. And it has to undermine their ability, the other side's ability, to do some of the things they do now. One of my favorite examples of a clever move in counterproliferation, essentially, was that Ronald Reagan and Casey, when they came into office, got together with a senior person or two at the CIA and came up with an interesting plan. The Russians were stealing computer technology. And the first instinct of most people would be, well, how can we get them to stop? Reagan and Casey had a better idea. They made it a little bit easier for them to steal the technology. It was relevant to counterproliferation and proliferation as well as other things. Made it a little bit easier for them to steal it and continued to look like they were working to protect it. As time went on, more and more of these bits of technology were deployed in the Soviet system. This is in the early 80s. And once that happened, it was possible, viewing through the low Earth orbit satellites, to see the Russian oil and gas pipelines begin to go up in smoke one by one. Did Reagan and Casey hold a press conference and brag about that? Absolutely not. Did they admit that they had done it to the Russian infrastructure? Absolutely not. Did they have a communications plan? Absolutely not. Did they try to get it so they could get promoted? No, 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 no. And that attitude, going against a proliferating, technologically proliferating enemy, and doing it with guile, with misdirection, and with skill, rather than trying to get out front and look like you're the big dog, is something that we need to work on rather hard. I hope both Mike Pompeo and his successor at the CIA will do that.
Jim, you seem to be one of the supporters, or used to be one of the supporters of the current administration. Now, if we try to compare some of the interesting decisions of this administration, for example, the recognition, we spoke before about Jerusalem, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel, the meeting with the president of North Korea. Let's say it's quite unique if we compare it to Obama administration. Can you share with us some of what's going on behind the scene in this administration?
Behind the scene is tough. It's hard often to get inside the heads of American politicians, and this particular group is even harder. I always used to say that when I was about 8 or 9 years old, playing cowboy, I used to enjoy being the black hat, and I've always found it a bit easier to understand what was going on in the minds of terrorists and dictators than what's going on in the minds of American politicians.
Not only Americans.
Well, that's true. Israel has made some contributions to that. But I think that President Trump fulfills promises. So even though there are a number of us, I think, including most of his supporters, who were not pleased at all at the tariff decision, he was fulfilling a promise that he'd made in the campaign, and the same has been true in a number of other circumstances. Fulfilling promises is good. Sometimes it's better to get them cut back a bit. We'll see. But so far, I think that the commitment and the sense of decision-making and clarity, including in the Mideast and including dealing with Israel, have been positive. The thing that worries me, frankly, is if he should start making decisions in the middle of the night by tweeting. You don't want to make decisions fast in that kind of job. I knew Admiral Jim Stockdale reasonably well, late admiral who was one of the prisoners of war in Vietnam, and Medal of Honor winner. And Jim Stockdale said that he was flying up above, flying cap that is leading the flights, up above the two American ships, the Turner Joy and Maddox, that in 62 were attacked allegedly by the North Vietnamese, which gave us the event to decide effectively to go to war with Vietnam. The problem was that firing on our second ship never occurred. It was an accident of interpretation having to do with a radar signal that was taken out of context and so forth. So the United States quite literally went to war with Vietnam, beyond having a few forces and as advisors, went really to war on a mistake. And so when you have something occur that you have to have your people make decisions about, you don't want to do it quickly. You want to do it carefully. It may just take days rather than weeks or months, but you want to get your people around, try out this idea, try out that idea, and the rest. And I hope very much that President Trump follows that path in any crises in the future, and not the path that Lyndon Johnson followed in Vietnam.
Okay, let's move now to 2028, 10 years from now. What do you think will be the main missions of the director of the CIA at that time?
Well, if we've had a peaceful time in the 3 or 4 years before 2028, then my sympathies go to the Director of Central Intelligence of 2028, because he will probably face what I faced, which was some extraordinarily fine members of Congress, members of the House, members of the Senate, but all of whom pretty well thought that we'd won the Cold War, so we didn't need to spend any money particularly on the CIA or really anything else that related to national security. It was not an easy time to try to keep our intelligence functioning. And I was glad that I had some strong and wonderful supporters like Joe Lieberman, but I didn't have quite enough numerically in order to keep from continually being in a battle with Congress over holding on to a minimum amount of money. We were in the early 90s in a period after the Cold War in which, as America often does, decided it was party time. And we didn't need to spend a lot of time and money on this intelligence stuff that people thought, people said. We had also, I think, an attitude that was also present in the country after World War I and very briefly after World War II, because Churchill brought us along, and Roosevelt brought us along, and Truman brought us along in 45, 46, 47 very effectively. But quite frequently after a war, including ones we win, the United States starts party time. And I mean by that kind of party, not political party time. It is Churchill's, one of his many wonderful lines was that the Americans always do the right thing, but unfortunately it's only after the exhaustion of all other possibilities. And that was the mood we were in the early 90s. That could well be the mood the country is in 2028, again, depending on what happened earlier. If a threat has been looming the last 2 or 3 years, people are getting mobilized, people are coming up with crafty plans like the one Johnson I mean the one Reagan and his DCI did. If that is happening, then the director may do reasonably well, but we'll have to see.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.